In this video, we're going to learn how to integrate a Django application with Azure Active Directory. We're going to learn what Azure Active Directory is, and we're going to learn how to register a Django application in Azure Active Directory. We're then going to use Azure AD to log into our application and then access a protected root in that application. And finally, we're going to learn how to set up multi-factor authentication with Active Directory. So let's get started. Now I'm on the Azure portal here, and you can see we have a bunch of services at the top. I'm going to click Active Directory just now. Now Azure Active Directory is a user and identity and access management service provided by Microsoft Azure Cloud. It provides a centralized place to manage users and groups and different types of permissions on your cloud systems. So on the left hand sidebar here, you can see there's a users tab under that manage section, and if we click that, you can get taken to a page and you can see the users that you have in your Active Directory tenant. And I've registered a test user as well as a user called 𝗵𝗽𝘀 in this tenant. Now a tenant is basically an organization within Microsoft Azure, and a tenant can have many users. The tenant is basically a directory of users that exist in the organization, and what we might want to do with Django is develop an application that's internal to an organization, and you only want to expose the application to users that are registered in this Active Directory tenant. So what we're going to do in this video is outsource the authentication to Microsoft Azure's Active Directory, and instead of using Django to authenticate, we're going to use AD. And this is useful in an organization. You might have a bunch of users already registered within this tenant, and you don't want them to have to manage a separate set of credentials in the Django application. Instead, you want to provide kind of like a single sign-on experience where they can sign into Django and access protected resources using the credentials they already have for Azure Active Directory. So we're going to see in this video how to set that up. And in the context of this video, the Azure Active Directory service that you can see here, it's basically an identity provider. You'll see that sometimes called an IDP, and it provides central access to users and resources in the cloud in this case. So what we're going to do to get started is we're going to go to this documentation here from Azure. We're going to follow through some of the steps on this documentation to get a Django app set up and authenticating using Azure Active Directory. And I'll link to this page below the video. You can see in the description here that an Azure Active Directory tenant, it's used to represent an organization, and it's within the context of that tenant that you will register and manage your applications, whether it's Django or FastAPI or Laravel, and even single page applications built with React or other tools like that. So we're going to scroll down on this documentation and we're going to go to this section here. This is about registering your Django application with Azure Active Directory. So in order for a web app to use the Microsoft Identity Platform, you must register that application with Azure AD. So that is the first step in this video. We're going to go to the default directory here, and we're going to go to the left hand sidebar, and you can see there's a page here for app registration. So let's click that. And you can see I've already registered the test application here. What we're going to do is click the new registration at the top, and we're going to create a new registration here. So we'll call this one Django test number 2. And we're going to make this a single tenant application so we can keep the top option selected here. And then we're going to scroll down and define a redirect URI here. Now the redirect URI is an important part of the authorization code flow that we're going to use in this video. And this works when a user authenticates with Azure Active Directory. Once the authentication is confirmed, AD is going to redirect the user back to the application. So we need to define a URL for that user to be returned to after they've successfully authenticated. Now if we go back to the documentation that we're following along with here, we're going to scroll down a little bit on this page. We're going to go to this section where we register an application. We're following along the settings that are provided here. We're going to copy this particular URL that is going to be used to redirect back to our Django application. You can see it's localhost 8000/auth/redirect. So we're going to copy that and we're going to paste it into the redirect URI here. And we're going to target the web platform here, and we're going to paste in that URL. Once we've done that, we can simply hit register, and that is going to create our application in Azure Active Directory, and it's going to register it with this particular AD tenant. Once that's been created, we're taken to the app registration page, and you can see some details about this application on this page. For example, the application or the client has an ID here, it's a UUID, and we also have a tenant ID as well, which is also a UUID. Now we're going to need these later on. We're going to fetch them from this page a bit later in the video and copy them to a configuration file that's going to tell a library how to access AD and what credentials to use. That's later on. Let's now continue with the video. If we go back to the documentation, if we scroll down here after we've registered, you can see it's telling us to take note of the application ID and the tenant ID. And the next step after that is to create a client secret for the application registration. So what we're going to do is we're going to go to the certificates and secrets blade on the left, and that can be found here. If we click that, and then we can click the new client secret, and we're taken to a page here where we can add a client secret, and we're going to give it a description of test, and we're going to stick with the recommended expiration of 6 months, and we're going to add that client secret to our application. Once we've created that, we're given a client secret value and a secret ID here. We need to copy this value here, so let's copy that to the clipboard, and we're going to go to VS Code where I have a Django application here, and for now I'm just going to create a new text file, and I'm going to paste the value of that secret here. Later on we're going to add this to a configuration file, but let's just leave it here for now, and we're going to go back to the documentation for this setup. Once we've created the secret, we need to create a user in the AD tenant. So let's go back to the portal, and we're going to go back to the default directory here, and we're going to go to users, and we're going to add a new user to this particular Azure Active Directory tenant. So let's create a new user, and we can give them a principal name of my user, and we're going to give them a display name of my-user, and the password is auto generated by default. We can untick that and generate our own password by default. And finally, once we've finished that, we can hit the review and create button, and that's going to create that user within the tenant. Once that's done, you can see there's a new user in this Azure tenant, and we have a principal name that we gave to the user when we created that user. So that's the setup done. We've created a user that we're going to use in this application, and imagine that this user is internal to an organization, and the user wants to access an application built with Django that is going to use the same credentials as Azure Active Directory. So we're going to add a Django project now. We're going to add the configuration to actually integrate with Azure Active Directory. So let's go back to VS Code, and what I'm going to do here is create a configuration file, and it's going to be called Azure Active Directory.config.json, and this file has to be called this aad.config.json, so make sure it's called that and we can create the file. And once that's created, we're going to go back to the documentation and scroll down to this section here where we configure the Django web app to use this application registration that we've created on AD. We're going to copy the values from this particular JSON here. We're going to copy that into this new file that we've created. And there are some placeholders in this JSON file. For example, here for the client ID, we need to fill that in with the correct client ID from Microsoft Azure. Same with the client secret or the client credential, as well as the authority, which requires the ID of our AD tenant. So to start with, let's go to this text file that we created. We're going to copy the application secret and we're going to paste it into this client credential section here. So I'm going to paste it into that section there. That's the client secret or the client credential. And once we've got the credential, we're going to go back to the Active Directory portal, and we're going to go back to the app registrations page, and we're going to click on the Django Test 2, and this was the application we registered earlier in the video, and we're going to copy the value of the application or the client ID here, and we're going to paste that into the JSON file, and that belongs under the client ID key. So we're going to paste that in there. And finally, we also need the tenant or the directory ID. So let's go back to the portal and we're going to copy that from the application registration. This is the tenant wide ID. We need to paste that into that section there. And that's all we need to do. We just need to copy the values from this JSON file that's defined in the documentation. And we're pasting that into this JSON file here, and we're replacing those placeholders with values from our own tenant configuration and our own app registration. So let's save this file, and we're going to remove that text file that we had. And let's now go back to the documentation again, and we're going to go to this section here. It's step 3 in setting up Django to work with Azure AD. And what it says here is that in the project settings file, we need to add this middleware class from the MS Identity web library. Now before we do that, let's scroll up to the top of this section. We didn't actually install the MS Identity web library, and this is a library that wraps the Microsoft Authentication library for Python. So we're going to copy this pip install statement, and we're going to go back to the terminal, and I'm going to make the terminal a little bit bigger here, and we're going to install that into this environment. Once that's installed, let's minimize the terminal, and we're going to go to the settings.py file, And I'm going to scroll to the top of this, and we're going to go back to the documentation and copy the code that we have in step 3 here. We're going to copy all of this code, and we're going to paste it into our settings.py file. And we're going to go over these settings now. On line 6, we create a configuration object, and we're passing that JSON file that we created just a minute ago, which contains our client secret and our client ID. So we're parsing that and storing it in this value here. On the line below that, we're creating an identity web Python object and passing the configuration to that object. Below that, we have an error template. So whenever we get an error when we try to access a resource that's protected and we're not authenticated, we're going to get this particular template. We're going to see how to use that a little bit later in the video. And finally, we're appending to the Django middleware this MSAL, Microsoft Identity Library middleware. We need to copy that line and cut it out of where it is, and we're going to paste that below the middleware list just so that it's appended to that list. Once that's done, we're going to check our work as it says in the documentation and run python manage.py run server. So the server's running, and on localhost 8000 we're getting the hello message, and that comes from a template that we've defined in the core application. So templates/index.html. It's this template here, and it just says hello. And we also have another template called secret.html, and later on we're going to try and protect this particular page using the identity library's login required decorator. Let's now get on to setting up an actual login and logout form on this Django application that uses Azure Active Directory. Now we're going to go to the documentation again, and after we've added those settings and checked that we can run the server, we can then continue to the next page in this tutorial. And this is about signing the users into a Django web app using AD. And this page explains a little bit the OAuth2.0 Authorization Code Flow. And basically, when an application needs a user to sign in, or it needs an access token to act on their behalf, it will redirect the user over to Azure AD's authorization endpoint so that the user can then log in. And once the user's logged in successfully, Azure AD will redirect the user back to the application using that redirect URI that we specified earlier. And when that redirect back to the application happens, the URL contains an authorization code, and that's why it's called the authorization code flow. This is an encoded string that only Azure AD can read. And what the web application or Django app will do is take that code, which is only valid for a short time, and it will include it in a request to the token endpoint. If we go down to the tokens section here, apps can request an ID token after a successful sign-in, and these are JSON Web Tokens, or JWTs. We're going to see a bit more of those later in the video. So what's going to happen now is we're going to start the sign-up process with our Django application. And the first step here is to send a request to the /authorize endpoint on Azure Active Directory. And the Microsoft Identity Web Library that we have installed is going to take care of that request and constructing that request for us. That endpoint will then display a login form for the user to authenticate, and they will authenticate using their Azure AD credentials. And if that's successful, they'll be redirected back to the application. So let's now see this in action. We're going to reference this section of the page now, and it gives us a bit of explanation about some of the auth endpoints that we have in our aad.config.json file. So I'm going to go to that file just now, and you can see we have endpoints for signing in, endpoints for redirecting, and also endpoints for signing out, as well as some other endpoints as well. So what we're going to do is go back to the documentation, and we need to register the Microsoft Authentication Library URLs within the project URL configuration. So let's copy this code, and this code is going to set up middleware and hook up all necessary endpoints for the authentication process into your Django app. And it's going to do that under a root prefix of /auth. So let's copy the code, and we're going to go back to the project here, and the project URL configuration, which is this file here. At the top, I'm going to paste in that code. Once we've done that, we need to copy the path, and we're going to cut that and paste it into our URL patterns. And finally, as you can see here, we need to import the settings module from Django. So I'm just going to go to the top of the file, and from django.conf, we can import settings. And once we've copied that code, we're going to go back to the documentation, and what we're going to do is continue to the next section of this page. And this is about actually signing into the app. We're finally going to create some roots in the application, and we're finally going to actually log into this Django app using Azure Active Directory. Now if we go back to our Django application, I'm going to minimize all these files, and we're going to go to the views.py file, and you can see we already have a view in this Django application, and it renders the index.html template, and that's the one that just contains that message that says hello. Now let's start by removing the message hello, and we're going to go back to the documentation, the section for creating templates. And what we're going to do, as it says here, is create an auth folder within our Django templates folder, and we're going to create a 401.html template to start with. So let's go back to the project, and we're going to create that folder called auth Within there, we'll create a 401.html, and this is the template that's going to be loaded when we try to access a page when we're not logged in, but that page requires the user to be authenticated, so it's a protected resource in our application. So we're going to add this h1 tag, and it says you're not allowed to access this resource. Once we've done that, we can close this file, and now we're going to fill out this index.html, and we're going to reference some variables in the template that are added by that middleware we configured within the URL configuration. If we go back to urls.py within this directory here, it's this MSAL views, and it's these URLs that we're adding, and that middleware adds this request.identityContextData variable. And that's a substitute for normal request.user in Django when Django is using the normal user model. In our case, we're not using the user model, we're using Azure AD to authenticate. So we have this variable called identity context data, and that has a property called authenticated, and that's a true or false value. So let's copy this if else block here, and we're going to paste that into our template. So let's go back to index.html and paste this into the template. So we're checking if the user is authenticated. If they are authenticated, then we display their username, which is another property on this identity context data. Otherwise, they have a message telling them they're not signed in. Now what we want to do is add a button that will take them to the login page, and that's going to be an Azure AD page that allows the user to log in. So below this message, when they're not signed in, we're going to add an anchor tag here, and we're going to use the URL template tag in Django, and we're going to reference that sign in URL that's defined within the Azure AD configuration file. It's this one here, it's called sign in. So that's the name of that URL, so we can reference that here, and we'll give this anchor tag the text of login. Now I'm going to copy that anchor tag, and I'm going to move this up to the if block here. This is when a user is authenticated. We want to give them the option of logging out of the application, and the name of that URL is sign out. Now remember, this login URL, it should take the user to Azure AD so that the user can then sign in using their AD credentials. It will then redirect the user back to Django after a successful sign-in. So we're outsourcing the authentication to Azure Active Directory. Now we're going to test this out in a second, but what we actually need to do is run the server and enable SSL. And that's because the redirect URL from Azure, it can only work with HTTPS. So we need to be able to run Django's development server using SSL. So how do we do that? Let's go to the documentation for Django extensions. And this is a library that I use in every Django project. It contains a number of useful utilities such as the shell plus command. And another utility it provides is this command here. It's called run server plus. And we're going to go to the usage section on the left hand side, and we're going to look at the SSL section. And what this command gives us is it gives us the ability to run this command run server plus and specify a certificate file. And if you look at the top here, it says to use SSL, simply provide a file name for the certificates. And you can provide a file name for a key and a certificate file, and they'll automatically be generated. Now, in order to use this command, we need to pip install this library, PyOpenSSL. So let's copy that command, and then in our virtual environment, we can install that library into the environment. Now, before we run this run server plus command, we also need one more tool. And if we go to the top here, you can see we need to install this library. I'm not going to try and pronounce this. I have no idea how that's pronounced. But I'm going to copy the name of the library, and within the terminal, we're going to issue a pip install command, and we're going to install also that library into the environment. Once that's done, we can run python manage.py and then the run server plus command, and we specify a certificate file, and I'm just going to call the file cert.crt, and we can execute this command. This starts a development server that uses this tool here and also has SSL enabled. And if we minimize the contents of the sidebar, you can see it's created a certificate and a key file, and these are used to actually sign and create the certificates. So we're now running in localhost, and we can access endpoints using HTTPS URLs. Let's stop the server. What we're going to do now is run the Django migrate command. That will create the SQLite database. And finally, we can rerun this run server plus command and link to that certificate file. And we can go back to the page now, and in the URL, we can change this to an HTTPS endpoint by specifying HTTPS, then localhost 8000. Now we have an invalid certificate authority, and that's because this is a self-signed certificate. We can go to advanced and then proceed to the web page, and we get this page here that contains that login URL that we created. If we go back to index.html, you can see it's this URL here, and it takes us to the sign in endpoint. So what we can do is go back and actually click this URL, and it's going to take us to Azure Active Directory in order to authenticate using their service, the IDP, the identity provider, rather than authenticating through our Django application. So what I'm going to do is click use another account here. And for the email address we're going to use, we're going to go back to Azure, and I'm going to go back to the users within this tenant here, and we're going to use this user here that we created just a bit earlier in the video. If we click that user, and you can see here we have a user principal name, we're going to copy that to the clipboard, and we're going to go back to the sign-in form and paste that in there, and we can then enter the password that we used when we created this user, and then hit the sign in button, and that's going to take us to this page that allows us to automatically update the password, and that's because it's the first time that we're signing in using this username and password. So I'm going to fill these details out just now and enter a new password. Once that's done, we can hit sign in, and finally we are going to be able to sign into this Django application. Before that, we're given a set of permissions here, and we can just accept those permissions, and then we should be redirected back to the application. And you can see the message has changed at the top here. It now says that we're signed in, and it gives us the name of this user. This is the username that we set for this user in Microsoft Azure. You can see that name up at the top here, and you can also see that the button on the page has changed from login to logout. So let's emphasize the flow very quickly here. We clicked the login button, we were taken to Azure Active Directory where we authenticated using the credentials that we have in AD. After that successful authentication, we were redirected back to the application, and you can see that the messages have changed here, and we are now considered to be authenticated within this Django app, and that authentication has come from Azure Active Directory. Now let's test the logout button here. If we click that, we should be taken back to this page, and we can select the user that we want to log out of the Django application. I'm going to select the user at the top here, and then it's going to log us out and redirect us again back to the application where we now get the message that we're not signed in. So that's how to log in and log out using Azure Active Directory in a Django application. What we're going to do now is go back to the documentation that we're following along with, and I'm actually going to scroll up here to the views that were created, and we're going to focus on this view here that has a decorator of Microsoft Identity Web.login required. So what we're going to do is create a secret view in this application, and we're going to protect it with this decorator. So let's go back to our web application, and we're going to go to the views.py file and create a new Django view here, and we'll call that secret. And that's going to take the request as an argument. Now within the templates directory we have this secret.html. We want to return that, and we also want to protect this view with the Microsoft Identity Web's login required decorator. Now this refers to something that we don't have at the moment in the template, so what we're going to do is go back here and copy this line of code, and we can then paste that into the top of the views.py file, and we also need to import from django.conf the settings module here, so let's do that. And this settings.ms identity web refers to an object that we created in the settings.py file on line 7 here, where we instantiated an identity web Python object and passed the configuration to that. So we're referencing that in the views.py file, and we have a login required decorator. So what I'm going to do is copy the code for the index.html, and we're going to bring that down into this secret.html. And we can remove the context. We don't need any context in any of these views. So here we have a Django view, and it's protected with the Microsoft Identity Web login required decorator. We now need to add a URL that's going to map to that view. So within urls.py, let's paste in the secret URL. And the name of this view is actually views.secret, so we'll reference that. And the final thing to do is add a link to this secret page. Notice the name of the URL is secret, so what we're going to do is go back to index.html, and at the top here, we're going to paste in some HTML. And this is an anchor tag that references that new URL. When we click this particular link, we should be taken to the secret page. So let's save this, and we're going to go back to our web application and refresh the page. You see now we have this secret URL link, but when we click that, we are not allowed to access the resource. And this is the template that's loaded from the templates/auth directory. It's the 401.html. It's a header 1 tag that says you're not allowed to access this resource. So what's happening here is we are not logged into the application. When we try and go to the secret URL, instead of actually loading secret.html, it's loading that 401.html error page. So let's again try logging in using Azure AD as our identity provider. We click the user that we had before, and we can provide their credentials here. Again, this is all managed centrally on Azure Active Directory, so we don't need a separate login for our Django app for these internal users. Once we've logged in, we're back on this page, and if we click the secret URL, we get the content of that HTML file. It's now loaded up because we are authenticated in this application. So the login required decorator allows this request to come to the view and load up this template, and we can therefore access the secret content. Now we're going to dive into a bit more of the technical content of this video now. If you're not interested in that, you can skip to the multi-factor authentication section of this video, which is later on. But what we're going to do now is load up the developer tools, and we're going to go to the network tab here and refresh the page. Now here we have the different network requests that have been made. If we click the secret request, on the right hand side you can click on the cookies and you can see that we have a session ID that's sent to our Django application. So every time we make a request to the secret page, it's sending the session ID, and that contains the given user's session ID. What we're going to do is go to Django's shell. I'm going to use the Django extension's shell plus command. And one of the objects in the database for Django is a session object, and this comes from the sessions framework that's built into Django. And this is a model instance, so we can query these sessions normally using session.objects.all, for example, and we get all of the current sessions in our application. And we see this one here, and it has this ID. It starts with 𝗵𝗵𝗽𝗀. If we go back to the browser, you can see that that matches the ID that we have here when we send this request. So the session that we have in this application belongs to the current user that we have here on this browser. So let's go back to the terminal here, and we're going to issue the same command that we did to get all of the objects, and then we're going to use the .first function to get the first session object in the database. And there is only one, so that's going to return that one to us with that ID. Now session objects in Django, they have a function called getDecoded, and that gives us back the actual data for the session decoded, and that's the data that's stored in the session for that user. And you can see it gives us back a bunch of key value pairs. We're going to store that in a variable called data, and one of the keys in that data is a key called identity context data, and if we access that we get back some more data here, and that key name actually matches what you can see here in index.html. This identity context data that is added to the request object, that's coming from Azure Active Directory. So what we're going to do is we're going to look at a particular key that comes back, and that's the _access token key. So the identity context data is a dictionary, and it contains a key called _access token. If we access that, we get back the access token that's coming from Azure Active Directory. And what I'm going to do is copy this token, and we're going to paste it into jwt.io. So I'm going to go back to the browser, and here we have jwt.io. What I'm going to do is go down, and this section here has the token. So what we can do is paste our token into that section, and we get on the right hand side the decoded header and payload data. Now what we're going to do is look at the payload data. You can see that it has information such as the user's principal. We see the user name, which is just my user that we set in Azure AD when we actually created this user. And we also have things such as the tenant ID that we have for our Azure AD tenant. So we have all these key value pairs in the payload of this JSON web token. And that's what's used to identify a user in this underlying library that we're using. And the token contains these claims or key value pairs that we can use to identify that user. And the access token is a key part of the authorization code flow in OAuth 2.0. When you first authenticate with the service, which is Azure AD in our case, you get back an authorization code, which you can then exchange for this access token containing all of these claims. So that's just a bit of technical detail. We're going to move on, and we can close off this page now and close the developer tools. What we're going to do now is go back to the Azure AD directory, and we're going to set up multi-factor authentication using Azure AD. Now multi-factor authentication is an extra layer of security that you can add to your apps, and we're going to go to a page for this just now. And as you can see, that based on the studies Microsoft have done, your account is 99.9% less likely to be compromised if you do use multi-factor authentication. And that's a huge benefit to add MFA if you have any kind of security conscious applications. So we're going to see how we can do it with Azure. There's two specific ways we're going to look at. First of all, we have a free option, and that's for customers who are utilizing the free benefits of Azure AD. They can use something called security defaults to enable MFA. We're also going to look at the conditional access policies that you can create in Azure AD, and this is a premium service that you'll need to pay for, and this will be typically used in an organization where you have more complex requirements around things like multi-factor authentication. So let's go back to Active Directory here, and we're going to scroll down on the left hand side to this part of the sidebar. It's called Properties. Let's click that, and it's going to load this page here. If we scroll down to the bottom, there's a section on managing security defaults, and this is currently disabled within our tenant, but what we can do is actually enable that and save this to the tenant, and that will then successfully enable the security defaults policy. And security defaults, it's a bunch of recommended settings essentially from Microsoft Azure, and one of these is to require multi-factor authentication. So let's now go back to our application, and we're going to try and log into this application with the same user that we used earlier on, but now security defaults are enabled. So let's see if that changes anything in the authentication flow. You can see we get a message here saying more information required, and that your organization needs more information to keep your account secure. You can select next to that, and what it's going to prompt you for is to sign up for an MFA application. So we're required here to set up Microsoft Authenticator in order to enable MFA. So we can click next and go through those settings. I'm not going to do that. You would just need to follow through and create an MFA profile for your user. And that's how you do it in a simple manner using these security defaults. What we're now going to quickly see is how to do it with conditional access policies. So let's close this page, and we're going to go back to the Azure AD tenant, and I'm going to go back to these manage security defaults, and I'm going to turn this off again because we need to turn it off before we can enable conditional access policies. The reason we're going to select here is that my organization is using conditional access. We can save that, and that's going to take us back to this page here. And once that's done, we can now go to the security tab on the left hand side, and on the left we have a section for conditional access. Let's click that, and what we're going to do here is create a new policy, and we are going to see that these are much more flexible than the simple security defaults that we enabled a minute ago. So let's give this policy a name of Django policy, and we can assign this policy to specific users and groups. So this is one of the more flexible options. We don't need to apply it to every user in our tenant. We can actually select specific users and groups. So I'm going to select a specific user and group, and I'm going to look at this user and group section here, and we're going to select the user that we are logging in with. We're only going to apply this policy to this user here. So let's select that user, and that will be the users section of this conditional access policy. Of course, in a real organization, you're more likely to target a group or a subset of users. We can apply this policy to particular cloud apps or actions. So what we're going to do is select an application, and we're going to go to the selection here and select this Django application that we registered. It's called Django Test 2. So let's select that, and we can add that to our conditional access policy. Underneath that, we can go to the conditions section, and here we can control access based on signals from conditions such as risk, device platform, location, client apps, or device state. Now, for example, you could use this to limit access to your application for users from a specific location. That might be a country. We're not going to select any of these. What we're going to do is scroll down to the bottom here, and this section for granting access, what we can do is grant access but require multi-factor authentication. That's one of the options. We can also require the device to be marked as compliant, and there are other options here as well that you can select. We'll select the top one for requiring multi-factor authentication. That's the only one we need, so we can select that and add it to our conditional access policy. And once we've done that, we can enable the policy by selecting the on option and then creating the policy here. And as you can see at the top right, that has successfully created that conditional access policy. And that is going to require multi-factor authentication for the specific app or apps that we set in that policy. In our case, it was just the Django Test 2 application that we're working with. But you can see the flexibility of these policies. Rather than just one security default setting applied throughout your whole organization, you can create different policies for different applications. You can restrict access based on locations and devices, and you can apply these to different users and groups within your Azure AD tenant. Let's now go back to our Django application, and we're going to test this out. Now, when we click login here, we're going to get taken to the Azure Active Directory login page. We can select our user, and it's going to tell us again that more information is required. We need to set up multi-factor authentication because of that conditional access policy. Now, I'm going to run through the steps of setting up MFA for this user using the Microsoft Authenticator app. We'll restart the video once that's done. Okay, I've now approved that in Microsoft Authenticator, so let's go back to the login page and try and log in again with this user. After we log in, we're taken to this approve sign-in request, and then we can use Microsoft Authenticator on our phone to actually approve that request. I've just approved it right now, and hopefully this is going to redirect us to the application. You can see it's done that. It's asking us if we want to stay signed in. If we select yes to that, we're taken to the app, and now we're logged in, but we have that extra layer of security from multi-factor authentication. And the settings for MFA, they're all controlled centrally in Azure Active Directory. You can apply them through conditional access policies to groups, to users, to specific applications, and to people in different locations who are using different devices. It's very flexible to do this, and the benefit again of using Azure AD, Azure Identity Provider, is that you can control all of these settings centrally, and your internal users can sign in and authenticate with the application using the same credentials, so it provides that single sign-in policy and it prevents you having to manage many sets of credentials in your organization. So that's all for this video. We've covered a number of concepts, including how to set up Azure Active Directory and how to add users to your tenant. We've covered how to register an application, whether it's Django or otherwise, with that tenant. And we've seen how to use the Microsoft Identity Web library and integrate that with Django in order to log in and log out to your Django application using Azure Active Directory. Finally, we've seen how to set up multi-factor authentication using AD and how that can give an extra layer of security to your Django applications. So that's all for this video. Thank you for watching. If you've enjoyed it, please like and subscribe to the channel, and we'll see you in the next video.